Please be aware the stream is now live.
Thanks, Drew. Emily or Jennifer, you let me know when you're ready for us to begin.
I think we may need to wait a few more minutes. There's still quite a few not on the call yet, so we want to make sure to have a quorum. I see at a minimum 7 people, and that's what we need to have a quorum. So I think we could start.
Thanks, Jennifer. And good morning. I'd like to call the General Academic Institutions Formula Advisory Committee to order. Again, my name is Daniel Harper with Texas State University System, serving as chairman. And before we begin, since we're on Zoom, I'd like to ask participants to state their name before they speak, mute when not speaking, and keep background noise to a minimum, which unfortunately I cannot do today because the city of Austin chose to work on the street this morning. And note that we are broadcasting for the public. And at this time, we'll ask Ms. Gonzalez for roll.
Miss Albright.
Present.
Dr. Blanchard.
Present.
Miss Brown.
Present.
Mr. Davidson is not going to be able to make it, but he has Trevor Simmons listening in. Thank you. Miss Deerdorf.
I'm here.
Mr. Duran.
Here.
Miss Kroll. Let's see, Mr. Hurley, Dr. Hurley.
Present.
Miss Mendez.
Present.
Miss Sloan.
Present.
And Mr. Tomlinson. He's not on yet. We do have a quorum, though. You can proceed.
Thank you, Jennifer. Next item on the agenda is to consider an approval of the minutes from our first meeting, which was held September 22nd, 2001. I think everyone should have the draft minutes in their materials. And at this time, I'd ask if any of the fellow committee members have comments, questions, or corrections to the minutes. Hearing none, do we have a motion to approve the minutes?
This is Susan Brown. I move to approve.
We got to have somebody.
Noel Sloan, second.
Daniel, could you hear that?
It looks like he froze.
Yeah. Well, I heard you, Susan, and Noel, I heard the second.
Noel, do you want to take the vote as vice chair?
Sure. We have a motion and a second. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, the minutes have been approved. It looked like Daniel dropped off. I was thinking he was just going to try to reconnect in. So do we want to give him a minute, Jennifer? Or would you like us to proceed?
I think that's fine. You want to wait a minute? There he is.
All right. I apologize for that. Apparently, I lost internet connection for a second there. All right. So did we have a motion, Jennifer?
We did. Noel went ahead and we've got it approved, so we can move on.
Perfect. All right. Well, then I guess next on the agenda is to go through the charges. And unless there's opposition, I'd like to start with charge 5 today. And as kind of a follow-up to our discussion that we had at our last meeting, we've organized a small panel with UT system, Texas State system representatives to talk about, I guess, ways to look at risk. And with that, I'll turn it over to David with UT system to go.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you so much for providing us the opportunity. So on the call, we have Tammy Rice from Texas State. We also have Dan Brown as well, just so that we could wrestle with this. Daniel, how much time do we have, just so that because I have a tendency to talk a lot, so I just want to respect your time.
I am the worst person to ask that question of. I don't know. How about this? I'll trust your gut, and then if so, we'll kick you under the table.
Okay, all right. Because this is a pretty lively discussion of at risk and how we're trying to get our heads around that. So what I'd sent Tammy and Dan a couple questions that I thought we could go through and sort of to have a conversation about our perspective and experiences with trying to examine at risk. And so I first want to sort of open the question about, from our perspective, what variables of interest have we used to identify at risk? So I'll start with Dan first, and then I'll jump in and ask Tammy also to discuss. You're on. Okay, good.
Some of the things that we've worked with on over the years have been all the traditional items. And I'm going to unpack this into items that, quote unquote, the student brings with them versus the items that we can measure and affirm once they've arrived at campus. Because as a student arrives, we can capture all that information about demography, about socioeconomic background, about Pell eligibility, generational status. We can capture all of that, but it's really not the same rich data set that we can gather once they've been on campus. And so it has been my better successes when we've started with that basic information to identify students and their risk status before they arrive, and then make that a more rich and more sophisticated package once we have even an early grade report in some instances, reports from faculty regarding academic behaviors, things such as that. The one piece that I think is important for us as well has been, especially when we look at the socioeconomic pieces, is remembering to consider the entirety of the student's experience. But with any of these features, when we're thinking about risk, taking a step back and not just looking at it from the perspective of what is the student not bringing with them, and instead looking at it, considering what kind of things do we need to be doing to better serve the students who are bringing those learned experiences with them to campus.
Great, thank you so much. And from my vantage point, it's so complicated because I think you also have to think about the outcome variables you're trying to predict against, whether it be, retention, first year retention, whether it be 4-year or 6-year graduation rates. What we've found to be beneficial is to think about the momentum points associated with graduation, right? It's very difficult to predict an at-risk for 6 years later of when someone would graduate. And so what we've tried to achieve is sort of looking at fall to fall retention as the biggest momentum point for our students. And, back in the day, I really tried to create sort of what is the biggest predictor or indicator for success for retention and graduation? Well, there are multiple, and I think you have to take them all at the same time. And so what we've done at System is working with our campuses to really examine pre-matriculated variables, both student characteristics and also the characteristics of where they're coming from, whether it be a high school or a community college, or even another four-year school for transfer students, to take that in combination to create an index score. So that it's not just a dichotomous either or, but it's a score that ranges. So one of our campuses, the score ranges from 0 to 15. Think of it as, and I would never tweet this out, but think about it as a credit score for a student as they're coming into our system, and really figuring out what types of experiences they had before they showed up to us. And then the other thing that, to add to the layer of complexity, I think this index score can vary based on the institution that the students are matriculating to, and also the types of majors or schools that they're going into once they've gone into our institution, because there will be different experiences with risk when it comes to very heavy STEM related fields of study versus more liberal arts STEMs based on their pre-exposure to the content. So I want to give some space for Tammy to comment on anything that we've said thus far or add to the conversation.
So the joys of going third, I echo much of what has already been said. I think what everyone is touching on is so many risk factors are situational, environmental versus innate to the student themselves. So when you start trying to categorize students as at risk or not, it's so difficult to throw that broad net, because it really is individual to the student, as Dan and David have both mentioned, their situation, their home life, homelessness, food insecurities, things the student cannot control, students where English is their second language, immigration status. I mean, you can go on and on and on. And excuse me, and when trying to, categorize the big picture at the state level, it is so important to consider things as the performance of the high school from which the student is coming to you from. Just coming from that high school put the student at greater risk than other students. And I think that is true. I mean, you can see it in just the performance of these students as you track them over time. And what this means is these students probably still have the ability to learn. They just need a little more support. What does that support look like is a whole nother set of questions, because that's individualized as well. So I think when thinking about funding at a state level, how best to serve the schools. I don't know if it's an award for graduating these students, or is it looking at the pipeline of students coming in and figuring how best to support the institutions so that they can develop processes to support these students. As David mentioned, looking at retention of these students, which, retention is such a good predictor of graduation and success, that I think those are all just important pieces. I'll stop talking.
Thank you, Tammy. And to shift gears a little bit, and to add to the conversation really is, I also asked them about any type of problematic. Is it problematic to only focus on one variable of interest? So when you go to the coordinating board's definitions of at risk, it shows an SAT or ACT at a certain national average. Below that, if they've received a Pell Grant. So Dan, from your perspective, do you believe that it's problematic to only focus on one variable of interest?
Most definitely. It's interesting. You got me thinking about an experience that I've had in the past, because all of the variables are such broad brushes. It's like you're using a large brush to paint your house versus trying to paint a beautiful painting. I think of one example in especially, David, Pell Grant eligibility is a great proxy for socioeconomic need. Expected family contribution is where you truly see the depth of need. And so if we don't look deeper than just kind of that surface level factor, sometimes it's a whole different story for the student whose family might have the ability to provide something toward that student's educational experience, compared to the student who's also Pell Grant eligible, also receiving full Pell, but the family has a $0 or even -$1 expected family contribution. So I think the risk of any one factor is we can lean on them too hard and see them as the end all be all. And when we do that, then we ignore all the other nuance Tammy and you both referred to that describes what the students and risk, what their challenges are as they come to college.
And Dan, I love that you honed in on Pell, because one thing that we have to acknowledge is the calculation of Pell is very complex, and there's a number of factors that go into calculating a Pell status. But even more than that, what we find is that based on the campus and our system, around 60% of our students receive the full maximum Pell award. It's not you get everything, you get nothing, but there's a continuum. And so I want us to be very careful on making sure that we're not giving too much power to the Pell status flag as it relates to risk. Tammy, do you have any thoughts about any problematic issues that you're seeing?
No, I just will echo what you all have said. And I think some things that have already been touched on by the committee is just the test scores as well. One, more and more schools are moving to test optional. So I do see in some of the data that was provided by the committee is that they're also looking at TSI scores, which should be more readily available. But as we all know too, test scores are not always the best predictor of student success. So that's all I would add.
Absolutely. And I think another variable of interest that's going to become dated in the near future is high school percentile, high school rank. We're finding with some of our institutions like UT Dallas, and the last cohort that came in, I think 30% of the students had a missing high school percentile. So I don't know what we do with that, how we resolve that, but I think that will become problematic when we try to focus or hone in on just one or two variables of interest to look at risk.
Yeah, we've seen the same thing with high school rank, either missing, we have calculated ranks that I don't put a lot of weight behind personally. And yeah, I think the student body, the incoming student body and what they bring with them is going to continue to change, especially as we move to more and more organic ways of admission. So I think all that should be considered. I mean, things that we should and do have available are high school GPA, high school performance, things like that may be considered when you're looking at a more global definition.
So let's hone on a little bit into that conversation about the environmental factors. So, yes, we focus on sort of student characteristics, but Dan, from your perspective, what types of environmental factors should we be considering when we're thinking about at-risk students?
It's interesting. I have a kind of maybe a unique or different take on this question, because one of the pieces that I'm becoming more and more interested in, and this might be something less that you would observe in some campuses in the UT system, but I think any system would observe this on a more variable basis. I'm becoming more interested than ever, whether it's thinking about a first time in college freshman or a transfer student, and not looking at this as a deficit, but looking at this as something that an institution, we need to be paying attention. How many institutions has that student attended? And I mean higher education institutions. So maybe I go to maybe I'm participating in dual enrollment in high school. And after high school, I matriculate to another community college for some credits. And I go to a 4-year and I stay for 2 semesters, but then I decide to go back to another community college and pick up additional credits. I think when we look at some of our profile of students, especially in the transfer space, we're seeing students that are coming in with more campus transcripts than we can imagine. I don't see that as a deficit. My experience has been students are making a wise judgment about course availability and cost and what works for their life. I see that as an institution. I have to flag that student and say, it's more important than ever that every transcript is articulated as soon as possible, that it's placed into the audit, that all those things occur. So I was thinking about that as kind of a different take on those factors, David, because I do think, whether it's here in Beaumont or when I was in San Marcos before, it's not unusual for students to go to the university, step back, go to the community college. Another community college offers the classes they need at the times they can take it, then they're back at the university. Do we always do our best work in helping to serve them? Because I think they have some pretty demanding needs we need to meet.
And I love that you said that, because it truly is a non-linear fashion nowadays. Nowadays, I sound really old when I say that, but but it really is this sort of non-linear. So our transfer students, we did a study to examine transfer students. We found that 1 out of every 5 transfer students coming to UT system institutions have gone to both a 2-year and a 4-year before they came to us as a transfer student. That's pretty powerful. And I think this also highlights the movement of dual credit and concurrent enrollment that's taking place in Texas, and how students are receiving high school or getting college credit as they're pursuing their high school diploma, and that adds to the complexities that's sort of at risk. So I also want to throw out proximity to the institution. How far did you live from, or how far did you travel to go to that institution, and how do you have the safety support network that you need to be successful? I think about the African American and Hispanic communities, where it's a very collectivistic, family-based approach to, am I going to be further away from my family? How can I support them in being successful? Because we even hear times where students will take out loan and send those monies back to their family to ensure that they have money. So I think it's a very complex issue. So Dan, Tammy, do you have any data that you'd like to share, or anything that you've done to demonstrate sort of this at-risk work that you've done in the past?
Tammy, you go first.
So I don't have any data to share, but I have experiences just in years in IR and with working with the system. And Dan and I used to be at the same institutions, so our office has provided data to him in support of his research in this. And one thing that Texas State University does is develops a transfer and high school feedback report that shows how students perform coming from certain schools. I just think that information is extremely helpful in kind of identifying what you might expect from a student coming from a certain area. I'm trying to think of data that are available readily at a state level. Things like that I think are helpful. I don't know, I mean, the unmet need, the expected parental income, I think those are better measurements of a student's need. And, when we talk about Pell recipient versus Pell eligible, I don't know the number right off the top of my head of the number of Pell eligible students that don't receive Pell. So, there's another factor that comes into play. And, I think everyone that has spoken, really has touched on the nuances of all of this. And I think if I'm understanding correctly, what this committee is looking to do is trying to find a way to standardize and support the institutions in promoting student success for students that fall into these categories. So I think it's a bigger conversation than the three of us talking to you all. But I mean, just know that I think all the institutions would be willing to have a deeper dive into this conversation, I guess, is really what I want to say.
And I love you that you said that, Tammy, because it truly is. I think this is a starting point, and we will be all in support of your committee and efforts to really think about thoughtfully how we best identify at risk. Dan?
Well, I think it's interesting. Tammy mentioned that, yeah, we worked together for a few years. And but one of the pieces, following up on something you mentioned earlier, here at Lamar University, and Tammy, this will sound familiar, when we reinvigorated revised lower division academic advisement, which was my big task at Texas State, and we've done it here now at Lamar before I arrived. One of the outcomes we saw with having that very intentional training and professional development for advisors, as well as expectations for their work, we saw and I pulled this number, in a 2-year period, an increase in the number of freshmen completing 30 semester credit hours in the first year of college from approximately, where's my number here? Approximately 30.7% in 2018 to 47.8% in 2020. So we're now to the point that nearly 1 out of 2 freshmen is completing 30 SCH. And earlier, David mentioned progression is the key. And so my goal now is to dig back deeper and look at what's the magnitude of difference between the student who completes 30 and the one that completes 27 or 24. Because with Pell eligible students, the additional classes require an additional investment of personal funds, because financial aid is based on 12 semester credit hours. So I really think taking that kind of look at I think progression is huge, David. I think monitoring and tracking where the student is on the path, and then finding ways to identify them, because now that's going to capture all of their experiences. It's not just that test score from their junior year in high school. That's where it's going to be from now on, is really looking at all of this and then following their path and seeing where we need to intervene.
I love that you said that, because I think that at risk is relative to where they're going, relative to what year they're going into, whether it be the first, second, third, or fourth. And what we're trying to do is capture that. I wanted to share my screen really quickly. I know we're probably running out of time, but I wanted to share my screen to show you some of the things we're doing to identify at risk. So basically, when we're looking at first time in college students, we're taking into account both student characteristics. So, previous college credit in high school, an early application, race, ethnicity, high school percentile, gender. We're also thinking about sort of high school characteristics. So there's some really great work that the coordinating board does to produce some outcome measures associated with the high school GPA in college. Also looking at the historical rates of high school retention of those going to, let's say, UT Dallas. And we can use that to our advantage. We can also think about the proximity, where they located, in state or out of state or homeschooled. And what we've done is we've created this calculation, taking those into account. And I wanted to show you, so we've summed this index score. So for UT Dallas, the index score ranges from a 0 to 15. Then we took that and we looked at the first year retention rates associated with those scores. And as you can see, those who receive a 15, there's 100% retention rate. 14, it's 98, 13, 97, and it goes down, and it's perfectly linear. I had my analysts like quadruple check this to make sure that it was accurate. And it is true. And so we're using this with a variety of our campuses to really understand, before they even set foot on campus, what type of risk are they associated with? And what I mean by relative to risk for the institution, so for example, UT Dallas has a great first year persistence rate for first time in college. It's 90%. So a student who might be falling below that 90%, we would deem as at risk because they're not on average with the other student population within UT Dallas. However, there are other institutions in the system where the first year retention rates are in the 70s. So you might reclassify that to really understand, are those students at risk? And then ultimately what we did is we created a dashboard that provides insight and information on the score of the index score. And then you can start looking at what that looks like by the population, by the high school percentile, by first generation status, by early app, college credit, things of that nature. And our campuses are starting to triage this so that if we admit them, we have a commitment to them to help them be successful. And so with this, they triage that to make sure that students who might be falling below, and like, let's say the 0 to 6, we can triage them to make sure that these 114 students have the resources, both academic support resources and other types of contacts to ensure that they're not falling through the cracks and they're going to be successful. And so that's the way we're really viewing at risk now, is sort of this continuum of an index score to operationalize it. So now I just wanted to open up the floor. We've been talking a lot. I just wanted to see if you had any questions for us.
Thank you, David. I guess I'll defer to my fellow committee members to see if they've got some questions they want to ask.
Hi, this is Lauren Blanchard. I won't start with a question. First, I'll start with saying thank you very much for the conversation. I think that it's been very helpful and illuminating. I know that there are lots of factors that we have discussed today, but if I had to draw any elements of what I heard that I think would be helpful to getting us to where we ultimately need to be, not only with our at-risk designation and how to qualify that. That number one is, David, you mentioned the fact that ultimately we need to look at what's the outcome. And it sounded to me that you were promoting degree completion. And if you will, I'd like to add timely degree completion as the ultimate goal, that perhaps this additional assistance is really helping students to be able to master. And so when I say timely degree completion, it also then feeds into the whole notion of making sure that students really are getting the kind of support that they need in order to ensure timely degree completion, which also then adds into the financial side. Because you want timely degree completion, because you don't want students to be saddled with the financial burden of additional tuition semester by semester until they do complete. So so that brings up that second element. So first of all, the ultimate outcome based on what you're saying is degree completion, and I add in timely degree completion. Now that does not necessarily mean that every student has to complete a degree in 4 years, or every student, especially first times a freshman, are in 6 years, but how we are defining it campus by campus to have a good sense of what that means for us in terms of timely degree completion. So that's the ultimate goal. So then what do we use in order to help us to determine how we can collectively in the state of Texas allow for timely degree completion for all of our students, especially those that are of at-risk status. And I heard academic preparation as one of those areas that we have to pay close attention to. And how we define academic preparation, I think, is going to be essential for us. I mean, right now, the state has been saying that we were going to use it by SAT, ACT, but we know, as I think I heard Tammy mention, that many of the campuses are moving into test optional, and some are just not going to use any standardized testing at all. So that would not be the most appropriate criteria, but we do need to make the decision of whether it's going to be grades, of whether it's going to be class rank, although I heard some of you say that's probably not the best route to go. But I think that there needs to be clarity on the academic preparation side, not only for first-time students, but also in terms of the transfer students. So you also mentioned socioeconomic need, which I firmly believe is a second critical factor that has to be taken into consideration if we are true to ensuring that at-risk status is given full consideration, that the amount of money that their family, the student and or his or her family makes really is a major factor in terms of making the decision of how we're going to support them. The third piece that I heard, at least you mentioned, David, is race ethnicity, because race ethnicity is one of the major factors, regardless of if you are already a minority majority campus like mine is, that still you have to pay attention to race ethnicity as it relates to timely degree completion. And so I know that those three factors are very essential in my mind. I heard Dan mention San Marcos. I just came from the California State University system, where this has been a major undertaking for the 500,000 students that are served there. And it's not only those three factors that were very essential. There were others that, Jennifer, I know that you mentioned around student well-being, where you have your basic needs initiative housed. That area becomes really important for homeless students and those that are food insecure and housing insecure and childcare insecure. I mean, we can just go on and on about those areas that really are essential to make sure that if we're looking at risk, that those are characteristics to be mindful of. The other just quick 2 or 3 that I wanted to mention as well is data enrollment management, but not enrollment management from the traditional sense, but enrollment management, ensuring that we're paying attention to student need. And that goes into bottleneck courses. It goes into ensuring that when schedules are actually produced, it's not produced just on faculty availability, that it really is produced on student need based on performance, so that students have every reasonable opportunity to be able to jump back on the persistence wagon, especially knowing that they don't have to wait yet another year to take the course that they were that they did not complete satisfactorily. So that's one of the other areas. And then lastly, I'll just say, and this is a big one that we have tackled not only at California State University, but at other universities throughout the country, is really looking at administrative policies that stand in the way of student success. And obviously, one of the big ones is the academic hold policy, that oftentimes we're holding students back from either registering in classes or even graduating if they owe $25 on a parking fee, if they owe $25 for a library fee, you name it, and that we're holding those students back. And then that's where the financial assistance piece becomes really important in helping them to really bridge that gap where the university can provide support so that students can keep persisting and completing in a timely way. So I just wanted to add those factors in, just in terms of what I heard you say, which I thought was very meaningful. And, especially with respect to the outcome, what are we ideally hoping to achieve? And in my mind, and based on what you have said, it's timely degree completion.
Thank you for that.
Hello, David, this is Joseph Duran. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So as Dr. Blanchard said, I appreciate the information you provided. And so my thought is, we've talked a lot about the different characteristics about what would define an at-risk student, about academic preparedness, socioeconomic need, race, ethnicity. We mentioned food insecurities, childcare, homelessness. When we look at I believe there are a total of 5. The coordinating board has 5 what we call attributes of at risk, which one would you say of those 5 would cover most of these characteristics? I have an idea, but I thought I'd ask.
Let's see here.
So I think it would be the Pell Grant eligibility.
Well, I think Pell Grant gets a SES, but back to Dr. Blanchard's mention about time to degree, I think part-time, full-time status plays a role with that, because the full-time, part-time create a momentum point for students to pursue that degree, but it also impacts the amount of aid they'll receive. So I would say full-time, part-time plays a larger role than potentially Pell does. I also think stop out. I mean, the fact that we have students who have to stop out to get a job to help support their family. I think it's amazing that they come back in and they finish. They're so resilient. But I think, at the end of the day, they have to pay their electric bill. They have to pay for rent. And we have to acknowledge that sort of continuity of enrollment that plays, because I think there's a much larger role with that than Pell does play. Well, let me take it back. I don't think there's a single factor. I think it's a combination of factors. So if we use this either or methodology, I think it's flawed. It's not just this versus that, but I think it's this and this and this that's going to create a much larger at-risk population.
I appreciate that. I'm just looking at it also from a logistical way of, the state is going to allocate dollars, and then those dollars are then, I think, so some way we have to have a way to, the statute asks us to, make sure that we allocate these funds fairly and equitably. So once we come up with that way, that methodology, then it's up to each individual institution to make sure that, we're addressing a lot of these needs that are out there. If a student has to stop out because of, to support their families or things, I know with the A&M system, we have what we call our Regents Grants Awards, and it's specific to students who have a financial hardship and to keep them into the pipeline. And so I think with this additional influx of dollars, it just hopefully is an add-on on top of all the good things that you're already doing at UT Dallas. Well, UT Dallas is not one of the regionals, but for all of our regionals, what they're already doing, this hopefully is an add-on that they can then utilize it to keep these kids in the pipeline and get them out in a timely fashion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to sort of, and maybe it's an opportunity for us to implode some of the metrics that we've used in the past. And Dan brought up an excellent point, thinking about unmet need and using that as a component versus Pell, so that we truly understand the unmet need of the family as they're supporting the student as they're pursuing that degree. Dan, did you want to follow up on that at all with the unmet need component?
I just think that's the factor that is increasingly at times challenging to have access to, because it's based upon a federal financial aid policy of the privacy of that student's record for their aid eligibility. But that gap, it sounds terrible. The fully funded Pell student could be remarkably different on the same campus. And from 35,000 feet, Pell is Pell is Pell. But when you start looking at it deeper, and I think that's where our responsibility as institutions is, we have to take the time and invest in taking the deeper dig. We have to know more, because, gone are the days where most of us went to college where they just told us one of us wouldn't be here next semester. That's not our role. We have to be better than that. And so I do think the unmet need and the expected family contribution, those are such key factors. If I could add one outcome, I really like this conversation about outcomes, but I think we could all be proud of being the institution that said our students are more successful in the subsequent college-ready course when they enter the university underprepared and have to go through developmental education. The coordinating board's co-requisite and project that we're all a part of is a huge, important project, but I think we could all be proud of being at an institution where those students who enter without the academic preparation that they might have had a generation ago are able to achieve college readiness in a timely manner, be successful in a course that applies toward their degree, and then continue that progression toward degree completion.
I have a brief question that follows on this conversation. Trevor Simmons, UT Arlington. What data does the coordinating board currently have that could support a recommendation along these lines from this committee? And maybe what data does the coordinating board ideally need statewide to improve the determination of at risk?
I can tell you my perspective. I don't want to speak for Emily, but I think that the coordinator, so all the data that we use at our system is coming from the coordinating board. So they have the financial aid data system, which is identifies unmet need and other financial components that could be used to really highlight, the differences between experiences based on income level. So I think FADS is an untapped data source that could really be used to benefit the entire state of Texas. And then they just have the continuity enrollment, full-time, part-time, they have the major. So they have everything that I've been using.
I would just chime in on one point that has been made. So the Pell recipient versus Pell eligibility, I know at some point we've had to look into kind of legal restrictions from the federal government on how we're allowed to use that data that's given to us in our financial aid database. So I think that that's an important kind of piece to keep in mind, is that we may not be allowed to kind of to use data that we collect from the FAFSA to do other things like doing funding formulas or other recommendations.
And to my knowledge, I think the Department of Education is trying to mock up a letter of clarification to clean up some of the confusion that was created based on what can be used versus what not used. What I always stand on is the FADS data is a state report. And so that's how I leverage the use of using FADS over the complexities of using FAFSA. Any other thoughts or
I
comments?
agree, David. That's how it has. This is citizen, and I agree with that. That's how we had used it in the past. It was because it was reported as part of a state report by the institution. We did not use FAFSA directly.
Because there's a lot more data.
How you slide.
Yeah, there's ISER data that's part of FADS that you can really get into the nuances, but I think that there are some, from my perspective and my colleagues across the country, Texas is in a great spot with the data that the coordinating board has organized and receives. We're at a much larger advantage than other states. And so I just don't know if we use the full extent of the mountain of data that they have to take a deeper dive, like Dan had said. Students deserve a deeper dive, and so that we can triage and make sure that they're successful when they're pursuing that degree. And I know the commissioners really created a number of initiatives to really help beef up how they use those data. So it's just a matter of time. We're on the cusp, I think.
So David, to kind of blend off of Joseph Duran's question, do you see a difference between the data used by the state if they wanted to allocate resources to the general academics or a subset of the general academics versus the data that an institution may want to use on how they then take their allocation and apply it to institutional resources?
I think that's an excellent question, and I want to go back, and I don't want to pun it, but I'm sort of punning it. What Tammy said about this being the starting point. What I could see us doing is going back to our institutions and asking that question, right? And really understanding, because any fund, I've always had a problem with performance-based funding because we've seen from other states across the country that it doesn't really work, right? And so how can we get monies into the hands of institutions so that it goes directly to the students to support them as they're pursuing that degree, lowering that cost, making sure that they feel like they financially belong. I think that's part of the things that we haven't really talked about is belongingness and making sure that students see themselves as a viable and a viable and valid student that can afford and pursue a degree. I think that, I'm a first generation student from the beginning, but I was the oddball of the family just that asked a lot of questions and had a financial aid advisor who really helped me think through the navigation. And so I think we just have to make sure that we have further conversations, that we just don't declare it today, but we figure out the best approach going forward.
All right. Any other questions from the group?
I just want to weigh in quickly on the question that you just raised, Daniel. This is Lauren Blanchard with University of Houston Downtown. And that is that, in my estimation, our real goal here is to really think about what the criteria should be in order for the dollars then obviously to be disseminated to the respective campuses. Then it's the responsibility of the campus to make sure that they're making decisions on how they're going to use those dollars to best support the cohort of students that they have identified to be of at-risk status, and that there should be an accountability arm to this, and that the state should come back on an annual basis and ask us, how have we used it? Let's look at outcomes. We know that those dollars typically are not going to be the end all be all. They're going to be commingled with other monies that we have set aside for student success, but that we will have a responsibility to make sure that we are sharing with the state that as a result of these dollars, that here are some of the results that we are seeing or beginning to see as a result of this. But it should be the institution's responsibility to make the determination of how they're going to use those dollars to support the students that are identified through the criteria that we're responsible for helping them to determine.
This is Tammy Rice. I just wanted to chime in and say I wholeheartedly agree with what you just said. I think when you look at the 10,000-foot picture of our campuses, I believe everyone is probably in a different state of how well they are supporting these students already. So to deliver a prescribed methodology of how they should spend the funds, I think would be challenging for the schools, because I feel some are much more advanced than others. Got some that are fledgling and some that have been doing it a long time. So I just wanted to speak out in support of that.
All right. Well, thanks all. I guess we'll let David and Tammy and Dan get back to their other job. I'll say. Thank y'all so much. I appreciate the content.
Thank you for the time.
Thank you for having us. Y'all have a good day now.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
All right. So with that, I think we also, I think, have some data that the coordinating board produced. They ran some weighted semester credit hour data for the biennium that compares the expenditures. And then we also have the TSI versus ACT versus Pell comparison. Seems like it'd probably be more natural based on that presentation to see if Emily Cormier kind of wants to walk through attachment B, which is the at-risk student data first.
Can y'all see the screen?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So at the last meeting, there was a couple of data requests, and I'll go through this pretty quickly since we've just had a pretty robust conversation regarding different ways of looking at academically at risk. But one of the questions that was asked last time by the group was really to look at how many students were not TSI met but were not captured in the definition of academically at risk, excuse me, due to having a below national average SAT or ACT score. So the data looks pretty complex, but really it kind of is just looking at, for grads in FY 20, 19, and 18, trying to break them down by their SAT, ACT score, or whether they had no reported score, and then comparing to whether they were TSI met in all subjects or were not met in 1, 2, or 3 of the subjects. And so looking at that, you can see that about 25,000 graduates are considered not TSI met, but had an above average SAT, ACT score, or had no reported score. So we're not being captured. So that's just kind of one of the questions we were trying to answer with this data. I don't know if anyone has any questions about it or wants to discuss it further. If not, then I'll go on to the second tab. The other question that was asked was basically, if you look at an at-risk student defined as being Pell recipient or the below average SAT, ACT score, how many students are you actually capturing just by being a Pell recipient? So we had our data team run all the graduates and then look at how many are recipients of Pels versus how many did not receive Pell, and then comparing SAT, ACT score and TSI met or not met. And so about 58,000 students, about half of the grads each year were Pell recipients. And then so the current measure of doing Pell plus below average SAT, ACT score gets you to 68,000 students. So it's the Pell plus below national average. So 85% of students in the at-risk definition are being captured just by being a Pell recipient. And you can see that for all 3 years, that's consistent. And so if you wanted to add those students who were not TSI met, you would be adding about 3,000 to 5,000 students more each year who are not currently captured under that definition of Pell plus below average SAT, ACT. So I'm not sure, again.
This is Joseph. So if I understand, just make sure I understand that, because that was the question I was asking to myself was Pell eligibility captures 85% of the students.
Of the current definition of at-risk students, yeah.
Okay, and so can you repeat what you said about how we get to the 74,229, the Pell plus?
So that would be if you also added in those students who are not TSI met, but are not currently captured as having a below average SAT, ACT score.
Thank you.
And that's statewide, or is that based on the campuses that have already been selected as your comprehensive regional universities?
No, this was statewide. This was just to kind of give an idea to the committee based on our conversations last time regarding those different definitions.
Yeah, Emily, that's a good question. Can you look at just the 20 and see what that percent is?
Yeah, we can follow up for the next meeting.
I'd be curious to see that. Thank you.
All right. Can any other kind of discussions for the group kind of on the student characteristic aspect of charge 5? All right. Well, hearing none, I mean, I think next is to talk with respect to charge 5 or about enrollment changes during the biennium, which was part of our charge. And Emily has, or Emily and Jennifer, I should say, have produced, I think it's attachment C, that has a lot going on. And Emily, I don't know if, or Jennifer, if you want to put that up for the group.
It's actually in the agenda materials.
Okay, so they have that. And for somebody who maybe has been able to spend a little bit more time digging through it, what I was hoping this would show or not show is if there really is an issue with enrollment changes through the biennium that we either want to make a recommendation to address either holistically or individually. You know, just within our system, you know, we have institutions that have fairly flat enrollment. We have an institution that is historically always up 1% or 2%, and then we have a few institutions that, you know, they're on kind of on a cycle, and it's not necessarily something they can predict, or, as I'm told, not necessarily something they can change necessarily, just based on, you know, either their geographic area or their student population that they serve. I don't know if any of the fellow committee members have saw any trends in the data that the coordinating board produced with attachment C.
Daniel, did that come out yesterday? Because I'm a little behind, or maybe.
That is a good question of when it. So I know it's on our calendar invite. It's in our materials. So there it is. And if we want more time to dig into it, you know, we do have a November meeting coming up. So as you may recall, when the coordinating board first produced our original materials, they looked at it, I think, on a head count basis. And this is pulling it to weighted semester credit hours, which is, you know, what the formula is based on. You know, when I look at it, I mean, there's so much variability by institution and by the bienniums for me to necessarily draw a lot from the beginning.
And just to kind of provide some context on how it was pulled. So basically, we looked at what the base year weighted semester credit hours were first. So using summer, fall, and then the spring that the legislature would have used. And then looked at what we would call year 1 and year 2 of the biennium. And so that kept the same summer, fall, spring. So it doesn't align exactly with a fiscal year or the academic year. It's basically just replicating the base year for each year of the biennium. And then we kept the expenditure study the same for each of those years that are being looked at. So it would be kind of an apples to apples comparison.
And I could see, you know, there being a benefit to, you know, I guess in the public ed sector, I think they call them fast growth districts. So, you know, a fast growth institution. You know, I look at UNT Dallas, which I won't speak for them, but you can see, I mean, it's in a pretty large growth consistently over the trend that we've provided there. I don't see that there's necessarily a concern that institutions or general academic institutions are really focusing their enrollment efforts on the base period and then neglecting the non-base period. I don't see that trend through this data. So that's, to me, wouldn't be a concern that the state would have for general academic institutions. But with that, I mean, unless the groups kind of has any observations, maybe we can spend a little time with that data between now and our next meeting, and we can revisit it to see if we have identified either a problem or an opportunity with respect to, you know, enrollment changes throughout the biennium instead of just looking at base period.
So Daniel, is the expectation that we take a look and either make a recommendation not to change anything or to change something? From a budget person, I like the idea of knowing what my dollars are going to be, at least for the 2-year biennium. So I'm not sure.
In our world, it'd be weighing, well, one, identifying kind of, you know, is there an opportunity to improve this by looking at either some pot of funds that could be available for fast growth institutions, if that's the issue that we identify. You know, if we were to identify that, you know, institutions, kind of like I said, weren't putting the effort into enrollment in the second year, in the non-base period year, you know, maybe that would be something we could try to resolve for. And if not, I mean, at the end of the day, if the predictability outweighs any kind of perceived benefit, then I think our recommendation would be to stay with a static base period.
This is Susan. I'm gonna channel my financial person, and I'm gonna say they would appreciate the stability much more than what I would assume would be not a huge amount that goes into it.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, I would agree.
And I think one of the intentions with this charge was also to just kind of consider or think about challenges or benefits. You know, what are the benefits of doing the base period versus are there challenges for those fast growth institutions in the second year of the biennium or first year of the biennium who don't see an increase in state funding until another cycle has gone by. So I think it's not necessarily, you know, one way or another, but just also to think through or note what are the challenges or advantages in different ways as well.
Thanks for that, Emily. All right, so unless we have kind of any other discussion on charge 5, I guess we'll go back to starting with charge 1. And as y'all know, charge 1 is about making the recommendations on the appropriate funding levels. And in the materials the coordinating board provided, which I'm going to try to pull up myself. Kind of shows total increase across all formulas, including the recommendation to add inflation to research, and the small institution supplement comes to 9.2%. You know, my observation really, you know, the big swing on those is looking at those research institutions shows that, you know, there is an opportunity to really focus them more as a formula instead of a static dollar amount. And then I think I've got some other talking points here. You know, we did update HEPI to 2.7%, and we're kind of pulling it through for years 21 through 2025, which would be the end of the next biennium. And then applying that kind of equates to an inflation rate of 6.8% overall. And then that's again being applied to all of these funds through 24 and 25. Not sure, any discussion on the results with respect to charge one from our September meeting?
No, this is Noelle Sloan. I appreciate the new run through this that the coordinating board did to show us how the numbers come out. I did want to comment that, I agreed with the recommendation from Ms. Mendez, I believe, at the last meeting, that while we're using the 2.7%, that was, I believe, the August report of the close of July. So the recommendation would be that the HEPI be updated when the final numbers are available for this calendar year.
Ma'am. No, I'm gonna note that in my notes to make sure we specifically incorporate that in our written recommendation. Any more discussion on charge one? All right, with that, we'll move on to charge two, which is study and make recommendations on the inputs, the operation support formula. And this charge two has a work group, and I will turn it over to Ms. Noelle Sloan to update the group on that.
Thank you. The charge number two, which is in your materials, did contain a number of segments. So just for that review, that charge two is to study and make recommendations on the inputs to the operating support and space support formula, and including items to review were the weights in the expenditure study, second, the tuition estimate methodologies, and three, the online adjustments in the space model. The recommendations from the working group for the first and the third items were shared at the September meeting and captured in the minutes. But of course, happy to discuss either of those if there are questions or further discussion on that. The working group met twice since our last full committee meeting, and we have just been focused on the tuition estimate methodologies. So the LBB and the coordinating board provided a lot of data for us, and through our committee's review of that data, one thing that we felt would be a recommendation that we would like to bring forth to the full committee is that when preparing the tuition estimate, to split it out separately for resident and non-resident, so that there is a estimate of semester credit hour growth for the resident population, and also then a separate estimate of SDH growth for non-resident. In our discussions, we felt that this would be a benefit and not a detriment to any institution. So if you have, you're an institution that has a larger population of international students, this would benefit by separating those out. And if you're an institution that does not have a large population of international students, there should really not be that much of an impact, or there shouldn't be any negative impact to having that split out either. That might take some of the larger swings out that some institutions have experienced. The second recommendation is really continue to review and discuss perhaps moving the general academic institutions to be based on actuals rather than estimated, similar to what is done for the health-related institutions. In our discussions, there is the discussion that you're going to have that lag time between the prior year and the actuals. prior estimates and the actuals. We also noted that health-related institutions probably don't have, and at least for the past 5 years or so of the data that we were looking at, general academic institutions have had a large trend upward in enrollment growth, whereas health-related is a little bit more constant or slower growth rate. So again, I think the easier lift is the first recommendation, to split the estimate between resident and non-resident. And the one that might take a little bit more discussion is the moving from an estimated to an actuals model. So with that, I'll pause and welcome any comments from others that were on group 2.
Noel, this is Joseph. Just thinking about the tuition estimates, if we were to go to use actual data, is there a way we could do a run that would show what would have been the impact to the actual weighted SEH rate if we were to fill in with actual data versus the estimated tuition data?
This is Emily Deardorff. I mean, conceptually, if we did actuals, it would lower the tuition estimate overall. So if you assume the same GR, I mean, the problem is it's kind of a two, you're pulling on one lever, but that would have possibly changed the conversation during session.
And that's what I was thinking, is that my guess is that it's going to lower it, and then everyone's going to focus on the fact that the state's lowering the rate or the funding, and it's merely because of a change in
well, I think it would also depend, though, if it was just because the GRD is lower from the onset, if the decision was to maintain GR, which is generally one of the options that you start with, then the rate might be a little low. It would be lower, holding all other things constant. But yeah, it just kind of, it's hard to know, since the GR piece is so dependent on how much the all funds is with the rate.
Exactly. I definitely think a good first step is what Noel was talking about, is just splitting the estimates between resident and non-resident. Definitely.
This is Stace, and I agree with that. I think that's a good first step. If we could just kind of continue looking at how it might be possible to use actual, like the health related, that would be good. But as a stepping stone, I do like the splitting it between the non-resident and resident.
I don't know if there's any other questions, but Daniel, that's all our committee had to report out. Back to the full committee.
Thanks, Noel. All right. Well, unless there's any more discussion on charge 2, charge 3 was study and make recommendations on the appropriate funding level for the research funds. We discussed that in charge 1. So I'll open up charge 3 for any further discussion. And hearing none, we'll move to charge 4, which is make recommendations about the funding methodology for the comprehensive regional universities that's established under Senate Bill 1295. And I'll turn it over to Joseph Duran to provide that update.
Thank you, Daniel. Our subcommittee met this past Monday, the 25th at 10 o'clock. I believe everyone was there. Dr. Blanchard couldn't make it, but he did provide us with his comments. We did, once again, I think it's be pretty quick, we did review the charge, we were asked to look at the allocation methodology, making sure that we felt it was fair and equitable. And that also the second part of that was that it promoted student success at our institutions. And so I think ultimately we were in agreement with the way that things were the way the language was drafted. There was some discussion that we already had about the fact that identifying the definition or coming up with the definition for at risk. Right now, the statute reads that you would either has to deal with SAT, ACT scores and whether or not you receive a Pell Grant. And so there was some discussion about that since some of our institutions are moving away and making that optional. So we agreed that we would let that, that discussion fall under charge 5, which we already had that. So I think I'm not going to go into that. But ultimately, we were, and y'all correct me if y'all don't agree, but we were in agreement with the way things are. The coordinating board, Jennifer, provided us with an update on how the $20 million would be allocated in this biennium. And as it stands now, I believe y'all all received that. So just a couple of points that we talked about the dollar allocation. The final allocation will be made based on February data. So we'll update the allocation. The coordinating board will base sometime in February when they have the final, I guess it's FY21 data. And we won't see any dollars until maybe April or May. And each of the 20 schools will get just the 250 base allocation. And then the rest will be allocated based on your share of at-risk students. It's our understanding that those dollars would be, you would be able to spend some of it this year towards the end of the year and through August 31 of 23. So you can start, I believe, I don't know if the governor's actually signed the bill yet or not, but assuming he does or he has, you can put some plans in place on how you would utilize these dollars. With that, Daniel, I think that was it.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I just looked online. Online, it says it's still sent to the governor. So maybe he's holding out on our recommendation before he decides to sign the bill or not. So yeah. I think the only thing I would add to it, we kind of discussed, when you talk about, the base rate versus the kind of per student split, this is so much in its infancy that we really didn't have anything to add, I guess, materially that would have changed that. So, all right. Any other discussion on charge 4? And hearing none, I guess our next meeting is November 17th, which is a Wednesday. I presume it's at 10 a.m. as well. We're going to work on getting the draft of a report out probably that week before our November meeting, so the group can start to review that. So hopefully maybe between the 10th and the 12th, you'll have you'll get something in your inbox that's fleshed out that we can discuss at the November meeting. And with that concludes our agenda. And next on the next would be adjournment. And unless there's any more discussion, do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved. Second.
Dr. Hurley and Emily. All right. Thanks all. And I guess all in favor say aye.
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 All right, perfect. All right. Our next meeting will be November 17th, 10 a.m. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.